The translator's voice faltered as Mai Tanaka's clear words cut through the boardroom. "That's not what it says," the 16-year-old daughter of a hotel maid declared in flawless Japanese, pointing to the contract that would have transferred ownership of her mother's ancestral land to billionaire developer Hiroshi Nakamura. The executives froze. What they didn't know was that Mai had been secretly studying Japanese for years, preparing for this moment. What they couldn't possibly imagine was that by nightfall, Nakamura's $500 million empire would begin crumbling, and that the person who set everything in motion wasn't even in the room. Aiko Tanaka scrubbed the marble bathroom floor of Suite 4701 in the Grand Imperial Hotel, her knees aching after 8 hours of cleaning. At 42, her once smooth hands had grown calloused from years of harsh chemicals and repetitive work. She was one of dozens of invisible workers who maintained the gleaming facade of the five-star Tokyo establishment, owned by Nakamura Enterprises. The irony wasn't lost on her. She cleaned the rooms of wealthy businessmen who were, at this very moment, negotiating to take the last thing her family truly owned, 3 acres of oceanfront land on Okinawa that had belonged to the Tanakas for generations. 6 months earlier, Aiko had received a letter claiming her property taxes were severely delinquent. The notice, written in complex legal Japanese, threatened seizure unless she paid 15 million yen, approximately $135,000, within 90 days. It was an impossible sum for a single mother earning barely enough to keep her daughter in school. When representatives from Nakamura Enterprises approached with an offer to buy the land for a fraction of its value, just enough to cover the supposed tax debt, it seemed like her only option. What Aiko couldn't know was that the tax notice was fraudulent, part of an elaborate scheme Nakamura had executed dozens of times before. The billionaire had built his fortune by identifying strategic properties, fabricating tax debts, and pressuring vulnerable owners to sell at devastating losses. The Tanaka property was the final piece in a massive resort development that would net him $500 million once complete. Mai had always been observant, quiet in the way children of struggling parents often are. She noticed her mother's tears over the tax documents, saw the resignation in her eyes when the Nakamura representatives visited their small apartment. While Aiko believed she was protecting her daughter by keeping her worries private, Mai had been listening at doors, reading discarded papers, and forming her own conclusions. "Mom, something doesn't feel right about this," Mai had said one evening as Aiko signed preliminary paperwork. "We have no choice, sweetheart," Aiko replied, the defeat in her voice breaking Mai's heart. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. But Mai refused to accept this turn. Unknown to her mother, she had been studying Japanese since she was 10, fascinated by her heritage and determined to connect with the language her grandparents had spoken. What began as cultural curiosity had become an obsession, and by 16, Mai had achieved near-native fluency through online courses, language exchange programs, and countless hours of practice. When Aiko mentioned that the final contract signing would happen during her shift at the hotel, Mai formulated a plan. She convinced her mother to let her come to work that day, claiming a school holiday. "I'll just sit quietly in the staff room and do homework," she promised. Aiko reluctantly agreed, unaware that her daughter had no intention of staying put. The morning of the signing, Hiroshi Nakamura arrived at the Grand Imperial with his legal team and 2 investors from Singapore. They settled into the executive conference room on the 47th floor, spreading documents across the polished mahogany table. Nakamura was in high spirits, just hours away from completing his masterpiece, a 200-acre luxury resort that would cement his legacy as Japan's most visionary developer. "Once we acquire the Tanaka parcel, construction can begin immediately," he told his associates in Japanese, unaware that the young girl who had just entered with a coffee service understood every word. "The old woman has no idea what she's signing away." Mai, wearing a borrowed hotel uniform, kept her eyes down as she arranged cups and saucers. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared they might hear it. The plan had seemed simple when she conceived it: listen in on the meeting, gather evidence of wrongdoing, and somehow stop the fraud. Now, surrounded by powerful men in expensive suits, the reality of her situation struck her. She was just a teenager with no proof, no authority, and no real plan beyond this moment. As she turned to leave, Nakamura barked an order for more coffee, barely glancing at her. She nodded subserviently, buying herself a few more minutes in the room. That's when she saw it, the actual contract, written entirely in Japanese, with terms drastically different from what had been explained to her mother in the simplified English version. The Japanese document stated that the Tanakas would surrender not just the land but all rights to contest the sale for any reason, would waive claims to any archaeological or mineral discoveries on the property, and would be responsible for environmental remediation costs if any issues were discovered after transfer. Most shockingly, the payment amount was 30% lower than what had been promised. When Aiko arrived an hour later, escorted by Nakamura's assistant, Maid was supposed to be long gone. Instead, she slipped into the room behind her mother, heart racing but resolve firm. As the translator began explaining the document in deliberately misleading terms, Maid could stay silent no longer. "That's not what it says," she declared, her Japanese pronunciation perfect, her voice stronger than she felt. "The contract says my mother gives up the land for much less money than promised and takes on environmental liabilities that could bankrupt us." The room fell silent. Nakamura recovered first, his face darkening as he snapped at his assistant to remove this insolent child. But May stood her ground, switching to English to address the Singaporean investors directly. "This man has built his fortune by defrauding people like my mother," she said, pulling out her phone. "And I've been recording this meeting since I entered." What happened next would later be described by one witness as watching a castle of cards collapse in slow motion. The investors, already nervous about regulatory scrutiny, began asking pointed questions. Nakamura's carefully constructed facade cracked under pressure. When he lunged for May's phone, one of his own team members intervened, a junior lawyer whose conscience had been troubling him for months. "She's right," the young lawyer admitted. "This isn't the first time we've done this." By evening, May's recording had reached a journalist at the Tokyo Financial Times who had been investigating Nakamura for months without sufficient evidence. Within days, authorities froze Nakamura's assets pending investigation. The scandal exposed not just the scheme targeting the Tanakas but dozens of similar cases stretching back 15 years. For Aiko, the revelation brought mixed emotions. Relief that she hadn't signed away her family's legacy competed with shame that she'd nearly been deceived and anger at the system that made such exploitation possible. But mostly, she felt overwhelming pride in her daughter, whose courage and foresight had changed everything. "How did you learn Japanese without me knowing?" she asked May that night as they sat in their small kitchen, still processing the day's events. May smiled. "The same way I learned everything important, Mom, by watching you. You taught me to be resourceful, to work hard for what matters. I just applied those lessons." The aftermath transformed their lives in ways neither could have predicted. As Nakamura's victims came forward, a class action lawsuit resulted in substantial settlements. The Tanaka property, now recognized for its true value, attracted legitimate offers that secured Aiko's and May's financial future. More significantly, May's actions inspired new anti-fraud legislation specifically protecting vulnerable property owners. But the path to justice wasn't smooth. In the weeks following the confrontation, the Tanakas faced intense pressure from Nakamura's allies. Anonymous threats arrived at their apartment. Aiko was suddenly fired from the hotel, the manager citing budget cuts while avoiding eye contact. Their neighbors, fearful of association with people challenging such powerful interests, began to distance themselves. For the first time in her life, May questioned whether she had done the right thing. The turning point came unexpectedly, through Haru Yamamoto, an elderly man who appeared at their door one evening, leaning heavily on a cane. His weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who had endured much in his 87 years. "You are the Tanakas?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. When Aiko nodded, he bowed deeply, remaining bent longer than his frail body seemed capable of supporting. 5 years ago, I lost my family's ryokan, our traditional inn, to Nakamura. The same tax scheme. The same lies. I have lived with the shame of failing my ancestors ever since. Tears streamed down his face as he straightened. But today, because of your daughter's courage, I learned it was not my fault. I was deceived by professionals who have done this many times. You have restored my honor in my final years. Word of Haru's visit spread through the community of Nakamura's victims. One by one, they began to contact the Tanakas, a farmer who lost rice fields his family had worked for centuries, a widow whose small beachfront home was taken through falsified paperwork, a fisherman whose harbor access was blocked after Nakamura acquired surrounding properties through similar tactics. These connections became a lifeline for Maid and Aiko during the difficult months that followed. When they needed to relocate for safety, it was Haru's nephew who offered them temporary housing. When legal expenses mounted, the victims pooled resources to retain one of Tokyo's most respected attorneys. What began as isolated individuals fighting a powerful corporation transformed into a community united by shared injustice and collective resilience. The investigation into Nakamura's dealings revealed a network of corruption more extensive than anyone had imagined. 3 tax officials had been on his payroll for years, creating the fraudulent notices that initiated his schemes. A judge who had dismissed early complaints against the developer was discovered to have received consulting fees through an offshore account. Even the police captain responsible for investigating financial crimes in the district had a son employed at a Nakamura subsidiary with an inexplicably generous salary. 6 months after Maid's confrontation in the boardroom, she received a call from Detective Keiko Sato, the lead investigator who had replaced the compromised police captain. "We found something you should see," Sato said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "It concerns your father." Maid had grown up believing her father had abandoned them when she was 3, leaving Aiko to raise her alone. It was a wound that had never fully healed, despite her mother's efforts to compensate for his absence. When she and Aiko arrived at the police station, Detective Sato led them to a small conference room where boxes of evidence from Nakamura's offices were stacked against the wall. "Your husband, Takashi Tanaka, worked for a small environmental consulting firm 15 years ago," Sato explained to Aiko, sliding a folder across the table. According to these documents, he was conducting soil samples on Okinawa for a preliminary assessment of several properties Nakamura was interested in acquiring. Aiko's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were reports, photographs, and finally, a death certificate. Takashi discovered high levels of industrial contamination on a site Nakamura had already begun developing without permits, Sato continued. These emails show he threatened to report his findings to authorities. 3 days later, he died in what was ruled an accidental drowning. Maid felt the room spin as the detective placed another document before them, an internal memo from Nakamura to his head of security, dated 1 day before her father's death: "Handle the Tanaka situation. No traces." "He didn't abandon us," Aiko whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He was murdered." The revelation added another dimension to their fight, justice not just for themselves and the other victims of fraud, but for Takashi Tanaka, whose integrity had cost him his life. When the case against Nakamura finally went to trial, Maid sat in the courtroom every day, often catching the billionaire's eye as he entered in handcuffs. Once, he had seemed a giant to her, untouchable in his power and wealth. Now, stripped of his tailored suits and surrounded by guards, he appeared smaller, diminished by the exposure of his true nature. The trial lasted 11 weeks, with testimony from dozens of victims and former Nakamura employees who had been coerced into participating in his schemes. The most damning evidence came from the junior lawyer who had first confirmed Maid's accusations, Toru Ishikawa, who had kept detailed records of every fraudulent transaction as a form of insurance against the day his conscience could no longer bear the weight of complicity. "I was fresh out of law school when I joined Nakamura Enterprises," Toru testified, his voice steady despite Nakamura's glare from the defendant's table. "I told myself I was just following orders, that I wasn't responsible for the decisions made above me. Each compromise made the next one easier, until I could barely recognize the person I had become." He turned to face the gallery where Maid and Aiko sat. It took the courage of a 16-year-old girl to show me that we always have a choice. That there is always a moment when we can decide to speak truth, no matter the cost. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed with journalists from around the world. The Nakamura case had become emblematic of a larger reckoning with corporate corruption in Japan, sparking a national conversation about the vulnerability of ordinary citizens against powerful interests. When the judges returned after deliberation, the lead justice spoke for nearly an hour, methodically outlining the evidence of fraud, coercion, bribery, and, most seriously, the orchestrated murder of Takeshi Tanaka. Hiroshi Nakamura was sentenced to 28 years in prison. His chief financial officer received 18 years, his head of security 22. The corrupt officials who had enabled his schemes faced separate trials that would ultimately dismantle an entrenched system of influence trading that had operated in the shadows of Japanese business for decades. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Maid and Aiko, thrusting microphones toward them and shouting questions in multiple languages. Detective Sato helped escort them through the crowd to a waiting car, but before they could leave, Maid asked the driver to stop. She turned to face the sea of cameras, suddenly certain of what needed to be said. "My father died because he refused to be silent in the face of wrongdoing," she stated, her voice clear and unwavering. 15 years later, I made the same choice without even knowing I was following in his footsteps. There is a Japanese proverb, the reputation of 1,000 years may be determined by the conduct of 1 hour. I hope that today marks the beginning of a new reputation for our business and political systems, one built on transparency, accountability, and justice for all people, regardless of their power or position. The clip of her statement went viral, translated into dozens of languages and shared millions of times. Overnight, May became a symbol of resistance against corporate malfeasance, her story resonating far beyond Japan's borders. Invitations arrived from universities, activist organizations, and government committees seeking her perspective on protecting vulnerable communities from predatory development. For May, the attention was both overwhelming and uncomfortable. She had never sought fame or recognition, only justice for her mother and, unknowingly, for her father. As interview requests piled up, she retreated to the Okinawa property that had started it all, seeking space to process everything that had happened and decide what should come next. The land looked different to her now, knowing her father had walked these same paths, had perhaps stood in this same spot looking out at the ocean. She wondered what he would think of her, of the choices she had made, of the future that now stretched before her with possibilities she had never imagined. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Aiko joined her daughter at the edge of the property. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light change over the water. "Your father used to bring me here when we were first married," Aiko said finally. "He would talk about how his ancestors had fished these waters for centuries, how the land remembered them all. I didn't fully understand what he meant then." She took May's hand, her eyes glistening with tears that reflected the fading light. "But I think you do. I think you've always understood the value of roots, of heritage, of standing firm when the world tries to move you." In that moment, May felt a connection to her father that transcended memory, a shared purpose that had guided both their lives despite the years and circumstances that separated them. She realized that her fight against Nakamura had never been just about a piece of land or even about justice for fraud victims. It had been about honoring the invisible threads that connect us to those who came before and those who will come after, about recognizing that some legacies are worth any sacrifice to preserve. The following spring, May established the Takeshi Tanaka Foundation for Environmental Justice, using a portion of their settlement money to create a legal aid fund for communities facing similar threats. The foundation's first case involved a fishing village in northern Japan where residents were battling a chemical company attempting to circumvent waste disposal regulations through bribery and intimidation. With the foundation's support, the villagers successfully blocked the illegal dumping and secured compensation for existing contamination. As word of the foundation's work spread, May found herself traveling throughout Japan and eventually across Asia, meeting with communities fighting similar battles against powerful interests. She deferred her university plans for 2 years, gaining a practical education in grassroots organizing, environmental science, and the complex interplay between corporate power and government regulation. By the time she finally enrolled in Tokyo University's law program, her experiences had given her insights no classroom could provide. During her second year of law school, Maid received an unexpected visitor. Toru Ishikawa, the junior lawyer who had confirmed her accusations against Nakamura that fateful day, had completed his community service sentence and was rebuilding his career with a small firm specializing in environmental law. "I've been following the foundation's work," he told her as they sat in a campus cafe. "You've accomplished more in 3 years than most advocacy organizations achieve in decades." Maid studied him, noting the changes since their last encounter in the courtroom. The nervous, conflicted young man had been replaced by someone with clear eyes and purpose. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "Every case needs someone on the inside willing to speak truth, just as you did." Their conversation lasted hours, ranging from legal strategies to philosophical questions about redemption and second chances. Before leaving, Toru hesitantly asked if the foundation might consider taking on an intern with a complicated past but sincere commitment to its mission. 6 months later, he joined the Takeshi Tanaka Foundation as its legal director, bringing valuable insider knowledge of corporate tactics that proved instrumental in anticipating and countering opposition. On the 5th anniversary of Nakamura's conviction, a documentary filmmaker approached Maid about telling the full story of her father's discovery, his murder, and the eventual exposure of the truth. Initially reluctant to revisit such painful history, Maid ultimately agreed after consulting with the families of other victims. "Some stories need to be told not to celebrate heroes but to prevent future victims," she explained during her interview. "If even one corporation reconsiders similar tactics because they fear exposure, or one employee finds the courage to speak up against wrongdoing, then reliving these events will have been worthwhile." The documentary, titled "That's Not What It Says," premiered at the Tokyo International Film Festival to critical acclaim. Its unflinching examination of corporate corruption and the human cost of unchecked development resonated with audiences worldwide. More importantly, it sparked legislative reforms in several countries, creating stronger protections for whistleblowers and more severe penalties for environmental crimes. 10 years after the confrontation that changed everything, Maid stood on the Okinawa property that had nearly been lost, now transformed into the Tanaka Memorial Ecological Park. What might have become a luxury resort exclusive to the wealthy was instead a public space where visitors could learn about traditional Okinawan agriculture, marine conservation, and the importance of corporate accountability. At the park center stood a simple stone monument inscribed with Takeshi Tanaka's name and the date of his death, alongside the words he had written in his final report before being silenced: "The true cost of development cannot be measured in yen or dollars, but in the health of our children and the legacy we leave for generations yet unborn." Aiko, now in her 50s but still possessing the quiet strength that had sustained her through years of hardship, managed the park's educational programs. She had found unexpected fulfillment in teaching visitors about the delicate balance between progress and preservation, often sharing her personal journey from hotel maid to environmental advocate. "My husband and daughter both taught me that courage isn't about being fearless," she told a group of schoolchildren during a tour. "It's about feeling the fear but choosing to act anyway because something matters more than your comfort or safety." As the children dispersed to explore the park, Aiko found Maid standing by her father's memorial, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, linking her arm through her daughter's. Maid smiled, gesturing toward a group of law students conducting water quality tests along the shoreline, volunteers from the environmental clinic she had established at Tokyo University after completing her degree. "I'm thinking about ripples," she replied. "How one action, one moment of truth, can spread outward in ways we never imagine. Dad's courage created ripples that eventually reached me, even though I didn't know their source. My small act of defiance created ripples that are still moving through the world." She turned to face her mother, the woman whose quiet dignity and resilience had shaped her more profoundly than any other influence. "And your ripples, Mom, your daily choices to maintain your integrity despite every hardship, those shaped the person I became long before any dramatic confrontation in a boardroom." Aiko squeezed her daughter's hand, emotion making speech difficult. After a moment, she composed herself enough to ask, "And what ripples are you creating now?" May looked toward the horizon, where the endless blue of ocean met sky. "I'm thinking about the next generation of advocates. About creating spaces where young people can learn to recognize injustice and develop the skills to challenge it effectively. The foundation has done important work, but systems only truly change when new voices with fresh perspectives enter the conversation." That evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, May sat alone on the beach, letting the gentle rhythm of waves soothe her thoughts. A decade of fighting corporate giants had taught her that change was rarely swift or complete, that each victory was temporary and each defeat contained seeds of future progress. She had learned to measure success not in dramatic courtroom moments but in the slow, persistent expansion of what ordinary people believed possible. Her phone buzzed with a message from Toru, now her closest colleague and, more recently, something more personal. "Turn on the news," it read. "Diet just passed the Corporate Accountability Act. Full disclosure requirements, whistleblower protections, criminal penalties for executives. Everything we fought for." May smiled, remembering the countless meetings, the strategic lobbying, the personal testimonies from victims that had gradually built support for the legislation over 3 grueling years. The law wouldn't bring back her father or erase the suffering of Nakamura's other victims, but it created structural protections that might prevent similar abuses in the future. As darkness fell, she made her way back to the small caretaker's cottage where she stayed during visits to the park. On the wall hung a simple framed photograph, her father holding her as a toddler, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. Beside it was the newspaper clipping with the headline that had started it all. "That's not what it says," Maid's daughter said in perfect Japanese, "exposed Billionaire's $500 million scam." May touched the headline gently, remembering the terrified 16-year-old who had found her voice in that moment of crisis. She had been so certain her life would be defined by that single act of courage. Instead, it had been merely the first step in a journey that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The next morning, she would meet with a group of international students who had traveled to learn from the Tanaka Foundation's approach to community advocacy. The day after, she would review applications for the Foundation's expanded legal fellowship program. The following week would bring negotiations with government officials about strengthening enforcement of environmental regulations in developing regions. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to speak truth to power. But tonight, May simply sat on the porch of the cottage, listening to the ancient rhythm of waves against shore, the same sound her ancestors had heard for generations, the same sound future generations would hear long after her own story had faded into history. In that peaceful moment, she understood something her father had known, something worth dying for, that the land, the truth, and the courage to defend both were never just about the present moment but about honoring the past and protecting the future. Her part in that eternal cycle might be small, but it was essential, one voice saying clearly, when it mattered most, "That's not what it says." If you found this story of courage and standing up for what's right inspiring, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more powerful true stories that show how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences in our world.